Welcome everyone. As Willie said, my name is Kim and I will be the student moderator for tonight. This event is a Veritas Forum, and for those of you who don't know, the Cornell Veritas Forum is an organization that strives to help students, faculty, and all those connected to collegiate life to ask and think on life's hardest questions and confront them. As a student organization, we want to put the Christian faith in dialogue, usually with people of other faith backgrounds and worldviews. Other forums, like the one that we're offering tonight, features only one guest, allowing us to dig deeply into what a topic or area of life means from a Christian worldview. Tonight's forum is on the theology of race, anger, and justice in the church. We found this important because historically, the American church, in particular the portion of the church driven by whiteness, has remained largely silent, complicit, and even contributed to racial violence, injustice, and racist policy. Yes, this forum came about due to recent attention to instances of racial violence that ultimately results from systemic racism, but racism has been enmeshed with the United States in its origin and existed even before the country's inception and has not let up. And now I would like to introduce our guest. Dr. Willie Jennings is an ordained Baptist minister and associate professor of systematic theology and Africana studies at the Yale Divinity School. His book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, won the American Academy of Religion Award of Excellence in the study of religion in the constructive reflective category, and in 2015 won the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, which is the largest prize for a theological work in North America. Besides his books, he has also authored many essays and reviews in the area of liberation theologies, cultural identities, and anthropology. So please welcome Dr. Jennings. Hello, Dr. Jennings.
Hello, Kim. I'm so glad to be with you.
Me too. I'm so glad. We are very excited to have you here and also grateful that, like Billy said, we are grateful that you are entering this space with us and giving us your time to speak with us. So, let's just dive in right into it. So to start, you have an award-winning book called The Christian Imagination, and it's on theology and the origins of race. Even this concept will be new for some of the audience tonight. So from your perspective, what has historically shaped our understanding of race today, especially in the church and the Christian faith?
Well, Kim, and thank you for inviting me and thank you for that question. The idea of race in many ways is born out of the church. The womb of it comes from the church. And it comes out of what many historians have called, we still use the term, the age of discovery, though discovery is a really loaded word. But it comes out of the time when Christians found themselves in parts of the world that they heretofore had not even knew existed. And race comes about as a new way of understanding the world. It comes about because three things happened at the same time. It was kind of a perfect storm. First, Christians were reading the Bible in a very strange way. That is to say, they were reading the Bible as though the Bible belonged only to them and did not belong to the people of Israel. They saw themselves as the people of God and Israel as no longer God's people. The technical term for that is called supersessionism. They saw themselves as superseding Israel. So they already imagined themselves as the main point of God's work in the world. The second thing that was a part of this perfect storm is that they found themselves in new parts of the world with incredible power, unchecked power, Kimberly. They could do whatever they wanted. And they imagined that God had set it up that way. The theological idea there is providence, that God in God's providence had put them there with that unbelievable power in order to not only convert those peoples that they were encountering, but to develop the world that they were encountering. And then the third thing was a very old vice, greed. Greed. they found themselves now with vast resources, more than they had ever imagined. So those three things, a vision of themselves as the center of God's attention, incredible power that they believe God gave to them, and three, greed, because they believe God gave to them the world that they had encountered, or should we say, discovered. And those three mixed together, tied to the way in which they started to see and understand and categorize all these new people that they were seeing, and the way they understood themselves in relationship to those new people. So it's out of that matrix, if you will, that the idea of race comes to be. And of course, what's crucial here is that it would not have happened had it not been for Christians. We were in a sense at the potter's wheel, ruining the clay.
Yeah. And so how would you say that how that understanding of what you just said affects race relations and how we understand race today in the church?
Well, so let's come to what really was the engine that drove it forward. So, and it's the idea of whiteness. Now, what's always important for people to understand is that whiteness is not natural. Whiteness is not a part of creation. Whiteness is not biology. Whiteness is a way of seeing the world and a way of being seen at the same time. And whiteness forms over the centuries of Europeans exercising incredible power tied to those three characteristics I mentioned earlier. And so whiteness develops as almost a kind of natural reality when it's not natural. It's a form of, as I said, a form of life, a way of being in the world. And so what that means is that you had there at the beginning of Christianity in the New World, in the beginning of modernity, as we say, you had Christianity already being formed with whiteness, forming whiteness and being formed by whiteness. So that for centuries, it's like a tree growing with a vine that is wrapped so tightly around it that you actually think it's a part of the tree, not realizing that over the years, this vine just grew right inside the tree, so that you think that just must be part of the tree. So, no, that's not part of the tree. That's a vine that's grew with it. So what took place is that Christianity formed in the New World, our Christianity that we've all been shaped in, formed in the New World with this idea of whiteness bound tightly to it. So that for so many people, they have never had to think about their Christianity in distinction from this thing called whiteness. And if they do think about whiteness, they think about whiteness like culture, like whiteness is, just the way people are, without realizing, no, it really is a kind of malignant growth inside of Christianity, bound to Christianity.
And so in an article that you wrote called European Christian Missionaries and Their False Sense of Progress, you talk about how whiteness, or to quote you, white agency and subjectivity had formed when people imagined themselves being transformed. And you talk about three different fundamental ways in which people were transformed as a result of whiteness, particularly, Black slaves who came here, and also indigenous people. Could you speak more on that, on those three fundamental ways in which they were transformed?
So, and so let me back up a little bit so that everybody can understand the context of that. So, and let's come back to this thing I just mentioned earlier. So when what we would now call Europeans, because they weren't called Europeans in the 15th century, 16th century, but what we would now call Europeans when they came to the new worlds, whether we're talking about what would later on be called Latin America or the Pacific Islands or Australia or Canada, so forth, or Africa, they understood that they were there. They were there because God had placed them there. And God had given them a twofold mandate: to save these peoples and to develop this world. And so a way to capture that twofold mandate would be the idea of maturity. They were to mature these people in Christ, mature them in their humanity, as it were, and also bring mature use to the land itself. That is to say, develop the land so that it is productive. Because for so many of them, the way indigenous peoples use the land, they thought was primitive, backwards, and not very efficient, and not good stewards, let's use that language, of the land. So they felt that their twofold responsibility was to develop the people, to save them, and to save the land, to develop it. And so the transformation that was necessary, reached from the body to the land and back to the body. So they wanted very much, as a part of the gospel mandate, to form these people lovingly, right? The language they often used was the language of acts of love, to lovingly form these people into good Christians, to assimilate them. And so you have a kind of threefold assimilation happening. If this was possible, to move people from being property to property owners, from being non-citizens to citizens, and of course, from being sinner to being saved in the sense of becoming Christian. So all of that was tied deeply to the formation of life and intellectual life inside of whiteness. So what does this mean? It means that for indigenous peoples and for immigrants coming to the new worlds, the goal was, as quickly as possible, to strip away your indigenous past realities and accept the new that God was forming you into, to strip away your immigrant realities and become the new that God was forming you into. And the new was white. We could say there was Anglo-Saxon Protestant as well in many cases, but the crucial matter is the transformation into a whiteness that signals maturity. Maturity of mind, maturity of body, and maturity of the proper use of the land, to exploit from it the things that God had placed in it, and to build upon it the things that were pleasing to God. A society, a city set on a hill, a holy place where God's reign would be seen not only in the earth, but in our bodies.
Mm. Yes, but clearly from what we know of history, that vision of progress ultimately was destructive. And
right, you're exactly right. But now here's the thing to keep in mind, Kimberly, as you know, and you mentioned this earlier. So if for so many of these folks who came, they found themselves with enormous power and resources. And so that, in many ways, it warps minds. I mean, imagine that in the old world, let's say in Spain or Portugal or what we would call Italy now, or England, or Germany. Let's say in the old world, you lived your whole life was basically in a 40-mile radius, your whole life, and you didn't own much of anything. You might have been a soldier, and you didn't own much of anything. But you come to the new world, and the king the royalty gives to you because of your service as a soldier in the New World, they give to you 40,000 acres. You have 40,000 acres, and on your 40,000 acres, there are animals beyond what you can count. There are rivers, there are trees, there's all kind of plant life. There are mines, gold, there's copper, there's silver. All this is on your land. And there are people there too. And you have control, you are given responsibility over all these people. I mean, basically you're like a king. So in your mind, God has done this for you. And your responsibility now is to rule properly. And everything you do is in a sense justified by providence because God placed you here, right? So it's that idea that works itself down into the bones of Christianity in the New World. Mm-hmm. It's the Christianity that carries forward what I call these three demonic virtues of formation: possession, control, and mastery.
That's very true. And so those three demonic virtues have obviously carried over into now. So for my next question, when we see today like instances of racial violence and injustice, such as video of George Floyd being murdered, or even just experiencing the systemic inequalities, I think our natural response is anger because it's wrong and it's loss of life. But for me, I feel that having anger or feeling anger, especially for these issues, like, and I'm speaking specifically like amongst Christian circles, I feel as though Black people or Black students, when we feel anger or when we're angry, that's frowned upon by other Christians, other non-Black Christians. Mm-hmm. But for you see anger as appropriate and necessary from your other work. So like, I want to know, like, how do you see anger as something that is righteous and also something that has to be shared?
That's an excellent question, Kim, and you made the connection right there. It's important for us to see our anger at this moment as tied to God's righteous indignation. And it's always a little tricky to tie one's anger or tie anger to God's righteous indignation. In order for it to be tied properly, it has to have two characteristics. Okay. The first, it has to be anger over the destruction of God's creation, the taking of life that was not given, life that was not created by the person who's taking it. Only God can take life. And so anyone who tries to take life in the name of God or in the name of order it's an idolatry. And so there's righteous indignation over the loss of life or the destruction of life or the mutilation of life. And then the second characteristic about this kind of anger, if it's truly connected to the righteous indignation of God, is that it's shareable, Kim. It's shareable. And in this regard, it's really important for all Christians, especially in the West, to recognize that we should be we should be sharing in a fury, a rage over this evil. And of course, here's the problem. For so many people, they don't understand that rage, anger, does not necessarily mean hatred. That's crucial. Mm-hmm. Christians should be angry. We should understand the ways in which our anger should tie to the righteous indignation of God, to be angry about what God is angry about, but not to hate. And what keeps us from hate is only one thing: Jesus. Jesus blocks the way to hate. Jesus says to every Christian, don't go there. Anger, yes. Hatred, no. Why? Because hatred will always lead to violence. And violence is the greatest seductive power that we face in this country. Because this country is addicted to violence. We are the most violent country this world has ever seen. We produce more weapons than anyone else in the world ever. We distribute more weapons than anyone else in the world ever. We design more weapons than anyone else in the world ever. We have more weapons than any other nation in the world ever. And so we're addicted to violence. And so we cannot allow anger to touch hatred and then pour itself into violence. But anger is also crucial, Kim, because anger is an energy and an engine that should drive hope. As I like to say, hope is not a feeling. It's a mistake, a deep theological mistake for Christians to ever think that hope is a feeling or a sentiment. Hope is a discipline. We have to be disciplined by hope. God doesn't say to us, it'd be nice if you hope. God says to us, you must hope. Why? Because our hope is calibrated, turned toward the resurrected power of Jesus. So we hope not because we see things are going to get better or they might get better over there in the corner. We hope because our vision is calibrated to the power, the resurrection power of Jesus. Now, but here's what's crucial. Let anger be an engine that drives hope and energizes our action. It's, I say especially to my dear white sisters and brothers about these matters, that they don't have to imagine that they fully understand the Black experience. That's not the point. What they can fully enter into is this rage, is this anger, and make it their own, and allow it to energize their hope and fire up their imaginations and their creativity about how we can change the given.
Yeah, everything that you said is so true, especially with, talking about like our white brothers and sisters. How many times I get messages, especially when things like this happen with like George Floyd, get messages just like, I can't imagine how you're feeling and stuff like that. I'm like, no, you can imagine what I'm feeling. Like, you should be mad about this. And so why do you think it's so hard for our white brothers and sisters to feel that anger or to, take hold of that anger? I mean, the answer might be obvious, but like, why do you think it's hard for them?
Well, what's the reason is because everyone in this country has been inculcated into being observers, spectators of Black suffering and pain. The first thing people are trained to do is to see the Black body and see it as a site of either danger or tragedy. And so people have been, their first response is just to look. Oh, that's so sad. And so the problem is that we have to shift people away from what really is another characteristic of whiteness, to imagine oneself from the position of observing the world and being able to sit back in comfort and decide how one wishes to think about what one is observing. So that has to be challenged. But now, of course, and we'll talk about this in a minute as well, part of this has to do with the way our communities have been formed in segregation. So peoples have had their whole lives shaped inside what I call profound racial geographic control. That is the control of how one interacts, engages, negotiates non-white others. So many people, their lives have been shaped that way. And so that deepens the habit of mind, of the body, of being a spectator of Black suffering, Black pain, as opposed to recognizing a shared reality of life together. And this is especially a problem for the church, especially the problem for the church.
Yeah, and so I guess to follow up on that, how as a community or as a church, do we work to realizing that shared purpose? Like how do we address systemic racism at a community level in terms of like segregation and the violence that is caused by segregation?
Great question, Kimberly. Great question. And here's the problem for so many people who've been thinking and writing about race, and so many of the folks who are doing activism now. All of them are doing great work. So don't miss. I don't want to make it sound as though I'm critical of them. It's all wonderful. My frustration is that for so many people, they have missed the most crucial matter, and that is the ground. That is the shape of communities, the shape of neighborhoods. Here's the thing we want to keep in mind, Kimberly. This is crucial. I want everybody never to forget this. All policing practice, all of it, follows zoning policy. I'll say that again. All policing practice follows zoning policies. The shape of a neighborhood, the shape of a community is the shape of disadvantage, is the shape of injustice, and is the shape of white supremacy. And so we have to focus like lasers on the way in which policing functions inside of control, controlling where Black and brown bodies are and where we don't want them. Here's another thing we want to keep in mind. In not every case, but in most of the cases where police brutality has been unleashed upon our bodies, it's because we were someplace where we were imagined not to be, where we should not have been. Or police saw themselves as coming as an invading force into a place they would prefer not to be, or they saw themselves as protecting a place from our presence. And we want to keep all that in mind and never lose sight of the ground. So what does that mean? It means that the way we can challenge white supremacy and racist structures that are in hearts and minds and in behavior is to start to challenge the way neighborhoods are constructed, challenge the way communities are formed, challenge the way in which real estate and developers and civil engineers and architects do their work. Segregation is always the precursor to violence. Segregation is always the precursor to genocide. And this is what we have to finally start to turn our attention to. So yes, we need policies at every level that addresses policing, and then we can talk more about the problems in policing. We need policies to do all that, but what we cannot continue to look away from is we can't look away from the ground. We've got to look at the very shape, the geographic shape of our problem. And for Christians, this is a real problem, because for Christians, we are geographically adrift. We don't even think about place. We think about churches and what goes on inside the building of the church and what goes on inside of our hearts and in our minds. And we imagine our Christian faith, heart, mind, and church. When in point of fact, that is so backward. Our God became incarnate and placed his feet on the ground. And we forget this. We forget this. And forget that our discipleship is a discipleship not simply in the world, abstractly speaking, but in places, in real places. And if we don't understand how real places function, then our vision of church, our vision of our ethics, our vision of our life is all really superficial, facile.
Mm. That's one. That is so true. And that's wonderful that you spoke to that. So here's my last question before we transition to our student and alumni panelists. And audience, don't forget to ask your questions and upvote the ones you would like to see answered at Slido. So my last question is, again, in your essay, European Christian Missionaries and Their False Sense of Progress, I really like that essay. You said, and I quote, "We need at this moment a Christian faith that can start to break our deep connection to whiteness by resisting its vision of maturity." Or you could also say false sense of progress. So, like we can't continue on the path that we're on, but we also just can't go back and erase everything that whiteness has done. So what are like the pragmatic steps that we as the church have to take to redirect ourselves or pave a third way?
Right. Great
Yeah.
question. Well, I think there's three things that have to be done. And we can talk more about this maybe with the questions. But the first thing is we have to, first of all, acquaint Christians with their story. Most Christians don't know their story. And what do I mean by that? We were Gentiles who joined the story of the people of Israel. We were guests in someone else's home. And the New Testament points us in the trajectory in which we understand ourselves as guests entering in. The colonial period reversed that. And it began before the colonial period, but it really came to its intensity with the colonial period. And we thought of ourselves as the host and everybody else as the guest. We thought of the Bible as ours. And we wouldn't teach everyone else how to read our book. And so most Christians don't understand in all the humility that is fundamental to being a Christian. You are inside somebody else's story. And you're there by grace, not because you merited. And so that's the beginning of starting to turn. Now, of course, here's the thing, Kimberly, that what I call that Gentile hubris is the enzyme inside of whiteness. It's the belief that I'm at the center of God's attention. And so that has to be addressed first. And it's an easy matter of helping people understand when they read the Bible. What they need to understand is that the word of God is first addressed to the people of Israel, not you. So if we were in the time of Jesus and we walked up to Jesus and we said, "There's Jesus," you know what we would see, Kimberly? We would see Jesus's back. He would not be talking to us. And if we try to get his attention, he would look at us and look back. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for my people. And you ain't my people unless you decide you want to be a part of my people." Now, and that's crucial for us because for so many Christians, they don't know this story. They don't know Acts 10 is our beginning. They don't know that Acts 10 is our beginning. And it's our beginning is rooted in the fact that there was a sheet lowered to a hungry Peter. And that sheet was filled with things that any righteous, faithful Jewish person would be repulsed by. And God said, "Eat it." And Peter said, "No, I'm committed to you, God. I'm not going to do that." And God said, "What I've made, what you have called unclean, I have made clean." Now, of course, the point is, Kimberly, that was us. That was us on that sheet, right? Most Christians have not been introduced to that story in any depth. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to understand the ongoing detrimental effects of segregated Sabbaths and of segregated life. We have to understand that segregation is so powerful because it gives us the illusion of control.
Mm.
And no one wants to give up control. And what segregation also does is it deepens in our hearts and minds the idea that our sense of comfort, our sense of safety, and our sense of what's normal happens when we are just with our own, which is the exact opposite of what it means to be a Christian community. And then the third thing is that we have to challenge what is another part of whiteness, which is what I call in the Christian imagination, the pedagogical imperialism that is a part of Western education. So just very briefly, because I know we're about to run out of time with this, but so that pedagogical imperialism means that Christians in the West formed believing that God had called them to be the teachers to the world, never the learners, always the teachers. Because the revelation of God in that way of thinking is always with God speaking. And so like God, if we are the bearers of that revelation, we should always be speaking and the rest of the world should always be listening. That pedagogical imperialism grew out of Christianity into the larger reality of Western education and Western life. So that Western people believe that they are the teachers of the planet. And whiteness is at the heart of that deep habit of mind and imagination that believes that they are the teachers of the world and that we in the West are the teachers of the world. And so those things have to be challenged. And unfortunately, so much of Christianity continues to perpetuate those three problems.
Yeah. Wow, that was such a great talk. That's it for my questions, but now we're going to transition. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for answering my questions. Now we're going to transition to hearing from students and student and alumni panelists and also the audience members. We're going to start with questions from our Cornell students and alumni who are with us right now, and then we're going to get into some audience questions. And again, for the audience members, please, in Slido, please upload questions that you would like to see asked, and also submit any questions that you may have. And if you want your video to be pulled up when you ask your question, please make sure to put your name with your question. So now on to our student and alumni panelists.
Hello, my name is Sharon Rose Alonso. I'm a Cornell alumna who studied theology. Your talk, can I just say wow? I mean, being a person of color invested in the future of our future, essentially, in this country. I've been to a lot of talks. Sometimes you start to feel a little jaded, but no, I learned things, and I feel like even as many of this were addressed to people who didn't share our experiences, I felt like I learned, and I felt like I was humbled, especially in relation to the fact that we weren't considered first. We were Gentiles. The Jews were there first, and the humility and the deference that we don't really have towards our predecessors. That was a humility check for me. My question to you, you had mentioned that we can't forget the ground. We can't forget how communities have been formed, how they're policed. And we know that there's a history of white supremacy within the police, from the abolishment of slavery as a means of subjugating people of color once again, and still to keep them in their place today. You mentioned how a lot of cases of police brutality are on individuals who stepped out of that realm. And so now there have been calls for defunding the police. There's been calls to dismantle. Minneapolis has done so. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. You said that we would have to start from the ground up, essentially, in reimagining what all of these structures would look like. So do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think it's feasible? Are you excited? I'm a little excited.
I am very excited, Sharon Rose. I'm very excited about the possibility. For the first time in history, we now can have a serious conversation about not only policing, but the large realities that surround policing. Policing is a symptom of these larger problems that we've already started to talk about. So yes, it does start with the ground. It starts with understanding that the police are a tool, a crucial tool to maintaining the geographic structure as it is, to maintaining communities and neighborhoods in the way they are, to protecting private property, and to assuring the control of those peoples and those subjects that people don't want in that property. So that's the first thing we have to understand, and we have to really attack that. You see, one of the most important things, and I want to say this now because I always like to say this when I talk to folks. You know, every community has some set of meetings where the decisions about bus routes, about real estate, about development, about how things will be set up is happening. And unfortunately, most of the time, Christians who have a moral conscience are not at those meetings. And those decisions are not driven by any kind of moral calculus. They are driven solely by market concerns and racial sensibilities. And unfortunately, because we're not there, that is where, honestly, that's where police brutality begins. It begins with you saying, okay, this is going to be a neighborhood where houses start at $700,000. So once that neighborhood gets built, that's already going to tell you what the police will be doing in relationship to that neighborhood. That already tells you, right? So yes, so that's first. But then we do have to think about, these three things along with that one thing. We have to think about the problem of criminalization. We have to think about what things are called a crime and what things are not. We have to think about, and here's where Christians have been incredibly naive, sometimes intellectually stupid, other times intellectually lazy. That is, we've allowed our vision of morality to simply be stolen and co-opted and exploited by people who want to talk about law and order. So that somehow what various governments will call legal or illegal, we then map on top of it right and wrong, without realizing that we should bring a critique to the use of the idea of what's legal and illegal. That we don't simply say, well, if they say it's illegal, then it's wrong to do it. No, we have always been more discerning that, because Christianity from the very beginning was seen as a criminal enterprise. So we have to think about the problem of criminalization, what's called criminal and who's called criminal and how criminal is shaped. Then we have to think about the formation of police officers. Who decides they want to be a police officer and why? What's that formation? And then what is the ongoing formation of police officers? I was on a panel once with a police chief, and he was touting how proud he was that they did a week-long diversity training for their police officers. A week long. And of course it was voluntary. It wasn't required, it was voluntary. But a week-long training of diversity. And then there might be some follow-ups, he said. And then off camera, off panel, I asked him, I said, well, thank you for sharing that. I asked him, so when police officers are introduced to their weapons, tell me about that. He said, oh, it's an extensive training. They start when they're in the police academy, and then they have to constantly keep sharp with their weapons. They have to practice, they have to log in so many hours, they have to take tests. They have to completely know how to handle their guns. So I said, so let's think about what you just said to me. Diversity training, 1 week, voluntary. Police using their weapons, a constant training, a constant evaluation, a constant testing. He got the point. But I was trying to make a larger point, and the larger point is, we have to get inside the formation of police officers. We have to get involved with who gets to apply, who gets accepted, and how they are trained. We need non-police to be deeply involved with who gets to be a police officer. long before we even talk about the training. And then we need to be involved with the training. We need to be in the rooms. Okay, let's talk about let's open up this training. Then the third thing, and this is what so many people are talking about when they talk about defunding the police. It is clear that policing, as we now understand it, is cancerous. It's cancerous. Policing, it's not just a question the police are being asked to do things they can't do. The very way in which they understand what policing is corrupts their soul. It distorts the mind, and it distorts any vision of a self that can build community. And I said this earlier. Here's what we got to understand, and this is what's so important. If we're just talking about a woman or a man who is a police officer, but isolated, that's one thing. But when we put that man or woman in the context of the brutality of America and how we are awash in violence and weapons, then anybody who's a police officer is right in the midst of all that toxicity, all the toxic reality of violence in America. And there is no way your soul won't be distorted in America if you're a police officer, because you're surrounded by violence, you're surrounded by guns, and you're surrounded by people who say, well, this is our God-given right. And so we don't understand that police officers are right in the midst of the sickness that is America. So you can't say, well, we just need to change a few techniques. No, because in America, policing is already inside cancer. It's already inside toxins. It's already inside violence. It's already inside a brutality that has existed from the day Europeans came here and started killing people for land. And so you can't simply say we're going to reform it. It needs exorcism. There is a demonic power. There's a demonic reality inside policing. And I say that knowing that there are many wonderful people who are police, but to deny that there is a demonic reality inside policing in America is to lie to yourself. It's to say, I'm going to step into a place that is filled with blood, and not get any on my clothes. Come on. You're just lying to yourself. You know, I have friends who are police officers, and they, in their quiet moments, they'll tell you it takes a spiritual discipline to try not to become something that you cannot live with as a police officer, much like a soldier.
That's amazing. You wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings. Hi, I'm Joseph Regal. I'm a Cornell alumni in city planning, and I now work as a ministry fellow at Chesterton House. And what you said about ground and paying attention to land we're on really spoke to me as a city planning major. So my question is basically an expansion of that. Like, how do you see the story of the Old Testament as a story of land and place, but also the story of America as a story of displacement of many people of color, indigenous people, and contemporarily too, with the redlining and zoning. So how do you think Christians should think about space and land in America, especially related to race?
Great question, Joseph. And what so many people know, and I'm sure you were exposed to this, and others were exposed to the way in which America understood, or Americans, white Americans understood themselves as God's people sent here to build the city set up on a hill. And that the way in which they understood this land, mapping upon themselves the same reality of Israel in the Old Testament. They understood themselves to be the new Israel here, seizing the land that God had given to them. And so they justified, in many cases, not in all cases, but they justified the taking of the land as them doing as Israel had done in the scriptures. And, you know, and there is in the scriptures, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, there is the story of Israel's conquest that we should never shy from. And the reality of that story of conquest, there is something that most theologians understand about that. And that is its non-repeatability. It's non-repeatability. What God did with Israel, and for the purposes, the theological purposes that are laid out in the scripture, cannot be repeated by any people. Now, of course, the problem is that not all Christians or the theologians got that memo. So in what we call the United States, they mapped that conquest story onto this land. In Australia, they mapped that conquest story onto themselves. In New Zealand, they mapped that conquest story. In the Pacific Islands and so many other places, they mapped. In Africa, they mapped that conquest story onto themselves. Now, so what does that mean? So we are the inheritors of a legacy of people claiming the land. Now, as you know, one of the most important things to remember about the history of America is that it is a history of the land. It is a history of the taking of land. And unfortunately, as I like to say, all of us in high school or junior high school and even in college, we are often taught harmless history. That is, we're taught history that is so sanitized, so small, that it bypasses this crucial matter, Joseph, and that is the taking of the land, the seizing of the land, the turning of the land into private property, the speculation of the land. That is what creates America, and that is yet what drives America. So much wealth, both corporate and personal, is driven by land ownership, by property ownership. And so Christians have to get serious about thinking about the morality of private property. We have to understand that race, the development of race, and the development of private property are two sides of the same coin. They happen together in the New World. And so being very serious about not only how the land has been taken historically, but what is being done to land now is crucial. We don't spend any time thinking about the moral and the theological implications of home ownership, of neighborhood involvement, of transportation, of cars. Cars are a problem. And we have yet as Christians to understand the problem that cars are. As Christians, we have gone right along with the formation of the landscape, both externally and inside of us, with these machines that do far more damage than they do good. I would love to see Christians start to imagine their discipleship and the living out of their discipleship aimed at undoing communities, deep intertwining with the automobile. It drives so many problems. It drives so much poverty. It drives so much disadvantage. It drives so much environmental degradation. It drives so much segregation. It drives so much of, as you know, creating communities that build inequalities by means of the way cars and roads and highways function. Now, here's the problem for us, Joseph. You would look long and hard to find any church in this country where a minister or a team of ministers is going to get up and talk about the problem of cars, except when they talk about their parking lot. but they want to talk about, the quality of caring for one another, the quality of touching one another. But here's what I want to say. Until you start talking about cars, whatever you want to say about the quality of life together is going to be hollow. You got to talk about cars. You got to talk about where we live. We got to talk about these things and realize that none of this is by accident, and none of this is beyond our involvement.
Thank you. Anti-car.
When I say this as somebody who grew up in Michigan, who grew up loving cars, but then recognizing, you can love a car, but you might want to try thinking about the world differently once you understand what that love actually works itself out to doing. Another question?
We do have more student panelists. There we go.
Darius, you want to go? Okay.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Jennings, for your words so far. They've all been very thought-provoking and profound to me. Yes, sir. Well, my name is Darius Scott. I'm a rising junior studying biological sciences. And I'm also a member of the track and field team here as well at Cornell.
Great.
Somebody asked in Slido about the formation of whiteness and whether blackness was formed simultaneously or was it a formation through a separate process. And I love that question, and I think it goes really well with the question I prepared. Mm-hmm. So the topic of I'm a Christian before I'm Black has been a controversial subject discussed by a lot of Black Christians across social media lately. And upon seeing this statement, I found myself just sitting there critically thinking about it. And I found myself agreeing to it. And then, but I didn't want people to get the wrong message from me that I don't love being Black or my Blackness. I'm unapologetically Black. Our hair, our skin, culture, all that stuff, the complexity of Black culture. I take pride in that. We take pride in that. But I think it comes to a point where all of that, our Blackness and stuff, becomes an idol over our faith, over Jesus. And it becomes something maybe that we worship more than God, that we love more than God. And I think that can be dangerous. I mean, we do hate injustice, of course. We grieve with our brothers and we fight against evil forces and for equality. But I guess my question here is, should kingdom over culture be the mindset of Black Christians, or is there like some sort of balance between the two? I feel like I already answered my question, but also in addition to that, in the midst of all the injustices and protests and movements and such, I was just wondering if this is an appropriate time to have this conversation on kingdom over culture. Maybe it could be like dismissive to the injustices and voices of the systematically oppressed right now.
Derek, great question. Great question, and very thoughtful. Thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
The important thing is to remember the story that we are inside of. And here's where we come up against a crucial problem for Christianity inside of the West, inside of the rise of the racial conditioning, inside of the problems of whiteness. We Christians should be exquisite storytellers because we're inside story, but we are not. We tend to be some of the worst storytellers the world's ever seen. We should be some of the best, and we need to learn how to think inside stories. So let's think about this very carefully. We're inside two kinds of story. The first story we're inside of is the story of God creating a people in the midst of a people. of Gentiles being brought into the story of Israel, and there inside the story of Israel, God lovingly forming a new people of Jew and Gentile, so that the new people, Jew and Gentile, they don't eradicate the identities of either. They draw those identities into a new, so that both claim each other, right? So let's call it a reverse assimilation. Let's call it a good assimilation. I know assimilation becomes a very bad word, but it's a good where the story of Israel becomes our story, and our stories are taken up inside of the people of Israel, right? So this is and we see this in the book, and we see this in the book of Acts. So Philip has to run and join the Ethiopian eunuch. Paul and Silas go down to Antioch, and there among all these Gentiles, the Jews and Gentiles who shouldn't be together are together, and there at Antioch is the first time they are called Christian. They're not called Christian in Jerusalem. They're called Christian down in Antioch, where there is this mixture of people who shouldn't be together, right? Now, that doesn't mean it's not like people stop being Jewish or stop being Gentile, but they become something new. A joining happens, right? We're inside that story. Now, here's the problem. That story has never been carried forward through us. What does that mean? So that means as Christians, we don't know how to enact a healthy assimilation without loss. We don't know how to enact a shared love of mutual cultures without fear that somebody's going to be wiped away. Their people, their cultures, their different are going to be wiped away. We don't know how to live in the beauty of the difference that God creates, right? So we're inside that story of a Christianity that still hasn't caught up with what God's trying to do. I mean, which means that we are some of the most culturally lead-footed people the world has ever seen. Christians are. We're like, okay, welcome. Because we don't know how to live in the multiplicity of a people who can live and love another people. As I like to say, the point is not that I know my parents and my story and remember my story and honor my story, to know my culture, remember my culture, honor my culture. The point is that you do, who's not a part of my culture. The point is that you know my story, honor my story, live my culture, understand my culture, sharing it as much as you can, and I do the same. And together, we carry forward. We carry forward together. The love is no longer, okay, I got to make sure I carry forward the cultural reality. So but now, my point is, so I'm going to get lost here. The point is that story is not being lived because it's not being told, because it's not being understood. But then there's another story we're inside of. And the other story we're inside of is the story of a whiteness that creates a blackness. Now, let's not get those stories confused. They're tied together, but they're not the same thing. Blackness comes into being at the site of whiteness. Blackness is the joining together of multiple peoples inside what theorists have called a racial gaze, a racial way of looking. Now, the genius of all those people who were violently joined together inside of blackness. And remember now, there was a time in which blackness was extended to people we would now call Asian, extended to people we would now call Latinx. But the genius of all those people who were violently joined together inside of a thing called blackness is that, to use the Joseph story, or to use what's in Romans, they took a thing that was meant to destroy them and they turned it toward the good. So they turned blackness from a thing meant to destroy them into a thing that they could make good. That's the genius of it, right? The genius is of a blackness that we can be proud of. Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, as James Brown said so eloquently when I was your age. Actually, I was younger than you, so I'm not that old. So it was turned into something else. And so, but now here's the problem. We don't want to forget that we're inside the history, inside the story of the creation of Blackness, even as we have claimed it as something good, even as we claim it as a catch-all to the multiple expressive realities, the multiple ways in which people of African descent and beyond in some cases perform a Blackness that pushes against the horrors of whiteness. So what does that mean? It means that Black folks have learned how to do something that people who have been identified as white have yet to learn, Darius, and that is Black folks have learned to distinguish between a Blackness that is derogatory, shaped in whiteness, that turns us into animal, criminal et al., from a Blackness that celebrates our cultural genius, our expressive realities, our joy, our sorrow, our complexity. We've learned to split those things and say to our children, you are not that. You are not Black that, but you are Black that, right? Now, a similar thing needs to happen, but in a different register for people who have been designated white. And that is, a splitting needs to happen, not a splitting between a good white and a bad white, but a splitting of what it means to be a human being from whiteness itself. Now, let's come to this crucial thing about Christianity. The problem is to put Christianity as a thing over against racial identity as a thing it confuses more than it helps. And so to say I'm a Christian first and then I'm Black, that's kind of confusing things. You really are not inside any story when you say that. I understand what's being said, that being a Christian is the determinate reality that drives forward my life. That's true, but it's not helpful to say Christian here, Black here, any more than it's helpful for someone to say Christian here, Indigenous here. I mean, you can do that, but that's already, when people do, I mean, not you personally, Darius, but when people do that, it's already putting themselves in a conceptual bind that's not helpful. So what is more helpful? What's more helpful is to say that I am someone who has found her life or his life deep inside the story of God. And that story is being worked out inside the horrible story of the racial condition of the West. I'm inside the story of God. And inside that story, I am a Christian who is in the legacy of resisting the racial condition, resisting the horrors of whiteness, resisting white supremacy. And in doing that, I am joined not only to people who have been named Black, but I'm joined to a whole lot of other people who've been named a lot of other things. And together, we are living our faith inside the deepest realities of who we are and have been. We can say culture if we want to. But here again, the point is not my culture. The point is our culture. Our cultures together.
Okay.
Follow?
I do.
I know you do.
Thank you for that.
Great question.
Hi, my name is Abby Bernard. I'm also an alumna of Cornell University. I studied history and Gov there. Thank you so much for everything you shared tonight. I loved, I'm learning a lot, and I especially love the part that you said that you grew up in Michigan, because that's also my story. I'm in Grand Rapids right now, so I love to hear it. Yeah.
You're in a big
great
city?
and state.
All right.
Yes.
How's the GR? How's the GR?
I feel so loved right now. This is great. So I love that we're talking about stories already, because this is really related to my question. I love what you were talking about, of this foundation of the creation mandate being what the impetus behind the formation of the idea of race in the U.S., around the world, and these demonic possessions that you were talking about, and how this fundamental misunderstanding of who we are, why God created us, the role that He gave us on this earth, led to so much of this destruction. And so I'm wondering what you think how we can redeem the story of the creation mandate, of who we are, what it means to be created in God's image, what it means to have dominion over the earth, what it means to be fruitful and multiply, what it means to be good stewards, all of these things that are wrapped up in the core of who we are, how we can redeem that to make it about Him and not these possessions that we appropriate for our own glory and ultimately destruction.
That's a great question. That is a great question. Thank you so much for that. Well, and I'm working on this right now. I'm working on a book on the doctrine of creation. But, what you're touching on is one of the fundamental problems that we Christians have inherited because of colonialism and because of whiteness. When Christians came to the New World, they already had a horrific way of understanding the word and the idea possession, right? So many indigenous peoples, and in the Bible has this vision too. In the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, when land is spoken about, and when ownership, if you will, is spoken about, it's not what we understand by ownership and private property today. First of all, in the Bible, as with so many indigenous peoples, the peoples that the Europeans found when they came here, the land and animals are not only alive, they're animate and they're communicative. And we live in a profound reciprocity with the living land. The land is alive. In the Old Testament, there are multiple places where it says that if Israel does wrong in the land will testify against it. In Leviticus, it says that if you do unrighteous, if you do unjust things, the land will vomit you out. The land itself, and animals give witness. They give witness to your behavior. As one philosopher said, for so many people in the world, past and present, they live with the idea not simply that they look at animals, observe animals, evaluate animals, but that animals look at them, observe them, evaluate them. They recognize that they live in a reciprocity and that their ethical vision, their moral vision is shaped by this reciprocity. The animals are not just there, not just there for me. I have a responsibility to live my life in such a way with them and around them that I honor our shared creatureliness. Now that's in the Bible, right? So what does that mean for the idea of possession in the Bible and for so many indigenous peoples? Possession means, first, not that I am in possession of something, but that I am possessed by something, that something makes a claim on me before I make a claim on it. And even as I use it, that's not the right word. So God sets us in the world as co-creatures with other creatures. Now, what I just said, you have to throw all that out the window when it came to the colonialists and when it came to the Europeans coming to the New World. They imagined the New World as possession in the sense we now understand it. It's mine to do whatever I want to do with it. And the problem is that the way they read the Bible, the way they interpreted scripture, the way they interpreted doctrine, the way they taught doctrine, and the way they understood their life, all built from that sick idea of possession. It's an object that I own. And so the idea of stewardship grew up on top of that sick idea of possession. So when they read the Bible about dominion and they ripped that passage out of its context and say, okay, this is what it really means to be the image of God, it was already inside a distorted way of understanding our life in the world. So we have to completely rethink what it means to be creatures, co-creatures with other creatures. So many Christians, Abby, they believe that the entire world, all the trees, the plants, the animals are all here for our use. They believe that everything is just a stage for us to do whatever we want. That God, these are all props, if you will, for the human. Now, of course, the problem is that way of thinking has always worked hand in glove with slavery. Always worked hand in glove with slavery. In order for a Christian to see slavery as an okay social form, you have to have a distorted vision of possession. You have to see that possession means I own it. So let's come back to your question. What does that then mean? We have to rethink from the ground up again what it means to be co-creatures, what it means to share a world. And here, one of the great problems for Christianity is that we have never, ever listened carefully. We've never allowed indigenous peoples to be our teachers. One of the great sins of Christianity in this country and in the West is that wherever it went, it silenced the voices, the knowledge, the wisdom, the understanding of indigenous peoples, because it imagined that what they said and what they knew was just demonic nonsense. And so it robbed us all of what God wanted us to learn from God's peoples, God's children, our co-creatures. And so what does that mean? It means that we have to rethink it all, maybe for the first time, listening to not only the current voices of indigenous peoples, but their long histories of suffering and knowledge, so that we might finally start to understand what it means to actually understand the world as creation.
Thank you for that. It's really insightful.
You're more than welcome. You're more than welcome.
Michigan.
Go GR.
Hi, Dr. Jennings. My name is Sophia,
Hello,
and
Sophia.
I'm a rising senior at Cornell studying physics. And I just want to thank you again for all the insights on all the questions that have been already asked. And I really appreciate what you shared about this desire to partake in our culture as opposed to my culture and your culture, right? And something that I've been thinking about along the way of this conversation is where you kind of like at an earlier point in the conversation, you've mentioned that people in the New World have never really thought about Christianity apart from whiteness. And it seems to me that this kind of perspective has not really changed in much of our current moment, right? And in our society. And I know I personally grew up in a community where I was surrounded by predominantly Korean American Christians. And as we recognize that churches don't really seem to know how to live between cultures and share and live in the midst of people that don't really look all the same, right? How can we, as the church, not only address, but also practically and actively work to fight against this unity in the church? And I think that goes along really well with one of the questions that were asked in Slido, where it says, as society thinks of alternatives to failed institutions, do you think the institution of the white US church should be dismantled? And if so, what alternatives? So how can we, I guess, like practically think of ways to not only work against this unity in the church, but if this institution of the church were to be dismantled, like what would be their alternatives, right? So I guess I'm asking questions about like how, as a church, we could take practical actions, right?
Great question, Sophia. And you know, there is a kind of dismantling, but it's not so much I want to see the church dismantled, but the church actually configured inside its most powerful legacy. So let's think about the contemporary dynamic that is creating so many problems. So because the way whiteness has formed socially, it has become an oppressive reality, and we can never walk away from that. It's an oppressive reality because of the way it's been formed socially. It's been formed to create spaces of control, spaces of domination, where that control and domination are hidden, and they are driven by what they create. And it gets back to what I said earlier. They create a sense of what's safe, what's comfortable, and what's normal inside whiteness. So what's happened, given that dynamic, for so many people, and that dynamic, as I said, is honed by churches. It has spread beyond churches, but churches were the womb of it. So what Christianity created, what white Christianity created in the West, was the need and the desire for so many peoples to create their own outside of that, right? So here's the reality for so many people. The only time they feel like they can let their hair down, where they can know what's comfortable, what's normal, and what's safe, is to be in spaces away from white people, or spaces that are not white. And those spaces serve a saving function, if you will, a delivering function, a therapeutic function that we cannot deny. Now, but here's the problem. The problem is that the white space is a fundamental engine of the non-white space, right? And so, in both the white space and the non-white space, you know, there is an inertia in both. There's a power in both, an energy in both that resist their dissolution, that resist their being dismantled, right? Because this is where, if I'm in a non-white space, this is where my own beauty, my own voice, my own sensibilities, my own thinking, my own story, my own history is honored, right? So what has to happen? Well, the first task is not to turn to those communities that have been formed as a place of refuge, of rescue, and say to them, dismantle. Now, guess what? Eventually you're going to be saying that to them. But that's not the first word. The first word is to these communities that are comfortably white, deeply white, energized by their whiteness, and to say, you must be dismantled. You must be dismantled. And that dismantling has to, again, come to the ground. You know, the resistance I get to this kind of thing I'm saying is when I go to white churches and they say, well, Dr. Jennings, you know, look where we are. We're out here in the suburbs, we're out here. And I always smile when I say, you know, and I say to them, you know, you didn't get here by accident. It took decades, sometimes centuries of planning for you to become this isolated all-white community. And now you can't just raise up and say, well, we're just here. No, because it takes incredible energy to sustain it, Sophia. It takes energy to sustain it. And what has to happen is you have to say to people that energy that you're using to sustain this, you must now turn that energy toward joining. Not controlling, joining. Now, of course, here's the problem. Because of the earlier things I said, in which we don't know how to talk about being together without fear of assimilation, without fear of loss, without fear of, you know, and white people always want to be in charge. we struggle with that. But now here's what we have to understand, and this is the most important thing I want to say to you about this. The Spirit of God is always pressing us to do this. And I give the book of Acts as an example. When the Spirit comes, the most dominant characteristic of the presence of the Spirit, Sophia, is that the Spirit is asking people to do what they don't want to do. And the main thing they don't want to do is to go be with people they would prefer not to be with. Which is why I say, in America, the vast majority of Christians are resisting the Spirit of God every day. And that resistance is not just me saying, no, no, no. It's the very structures I inhabit are saying to the Holy Spirit, no. No. We're not going to do that. We're not going to reconfigure our lives to be together. And we're not going to listen to who the Spirit wants us to join. So there is a dismantling that has to happen, but that dismantling begins by people yielding finally and fully to the Spirit of the living God and stop resisting. Everywhere I go, you know, and people always tell me, and you know, the Spirit of God is always driving us to connect with people we prefer not to connect to, and especially churches. And churches work really hard to ignore what the Spirit is clearly pushing them to do. Specific people in their area to connect to. Now, so what does that mean for the reconfiguring of the church? It means that the reconfiguring of the church that needs to happen, the dismantling of a kind of institutionalization, is the dismantling of an institutionalization that believes that comfort, safety, and normalcy happens only when I'm with people who are like me. That is the fundamental theological flaw in our church vision. We think it's normal to be in churches that are all one ethnic group. And I have heard people, theologians, argue this. And I sit there and I think, you know, it is fundamentally stupid. I just have to say that. Because it makes no sense of the gospel. We are inside somebody else's story. How are you going to say that we are inside somebody's story and for the purpose of God creating homogeneous churches? I mean, that's the stupidest thing anybody could ever think. But we think that. And the reason we think that, again, is because our sense of what's safe, what's normal, and what is pleasurable is same, as in the South they say, same color, kin, and kind. That's what has to be dismantled. That has to be fundamentally dismantled. It's difficult because it takes courage, and it takes people willing to risk. It takes people willing to say, I am with you for the long haul. I'm with you not just to talk, but to listen. I'm with you, and I'll say stupid things, and you'll say stupid things to me. But just like people who are in love, we'll forgive each other because we want to be together. That's what it takes. Now, of course, let me say this before I stop, because this is crucial. Given what's going on in America, there are so many people of color who are just exhausted. They are exhausted. They are fatigued beyond belief, because the way in which relationships, white and black, have functioned, especially in the church, is one of exploitation and utility. Let me tell you this quick story, because I know I'm going over now, but look at this. So there was a pastor, he wanted to meet me because he pastors a predominantly white church, but many of the black folks in his church were leaving, and he was trying to figure out why they were leaving. And so, and then there was a woman, there was an African-American woman who was on leadership at his church, and she had tenured her resignation, said she was leaving too, and he couldn't understand why. And I said, well, tell me about your last conversation. And he said he had been trying to reach out to her, and said, so tell me about the conversations in which you were trying to reach out to her. So this was a guy who had done a PhD, and he was a pastor. And so he was having lunch with this African-American woman who's on his staff. That's the way you put it, on his staff. And he said, I said to her, I really believe in reconciliation and racial justice, and I need your help. So what I want you to do is tell me, what books ought I be reading right now? If you could give me a list of the books that you think I ought to read, that would be really helpful. That's what he said to this sister who was his colleague in ministry on his church. And so he said this, and he couldn't understand why she was not happy about this. And then I said to him, I said, Pastor, let me ask you this. He said, I said, you have a PhD, right? He said, yes, I have a PhD. So that means you know how to do research, right? He said, yeah, I don't do research. Because you have a PhD, right? He said, I do. So you don't do research, right? So I said, when you want to find out something, what do you do? I go to the library, right, so you do research, that's what you do. But now, here's what you said to this sister who's your colleague at your church. You said to her, this is what you said actually. You said, I don't care enough on my own to go out and do research, get a bunch of books, read them, and then have lunch with you and sit down and let you then evaluate my reading of my books. That is to say, what I've said to you is that you go do the work for me, tell me what I ought to read, bring the books to me, and I'll get to it. Oh, is that what I said? I said, yeah, that's what you said. The relationships that have been set up inside this asymmetrical power relationship of exploitation, so that people of color are seen as the resources to help white people be better. And no church can survive with that kind of reality. No church can survive. A different vision has to be created, one in which people love each other, commit to each other, and do what love requires. And so let me come back to that example. So to the pastor, what you need to do is you need to say to her, you need to apologize for treating her like a servant. And you need to go do research. And then if she is so willing, after you have read and done proper research like you're supposed to, after you've taken some classes, after you've listened to people, have lunch with her and then just talk. And if she chooses to correct something you say thank you, because you care so much that you want to enter fully into the story and the knowledges of people that you have found it not necessary to know much about. All right, okay. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much.